And we're live. We are back. This is Luke Johnson from the Noetic Philosophy Humanities Teaching app. And we have a very special guest, Joseph, did I get your name right here? Trullinger? Did I say it right?
Yeah.
This is our second installment with Joseph. And we are just about to begin the discussion of the prefaces to Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. And Joseph, I think I've got like a pretty good handle on like how Kant goes and establishes the highest good and how God is necessitated for these postulations. But I think it would probably be best if you set it up. Usually I commandeer and take control of all these sessions, but I feel like you would do it infinitely better than me. If you would not mind, if you would maybe kind of say what Kant aims to do here in this first preface.
Sure, be happy to. So there are two basic goals of the first preface. The first goal is for Kant to talk about the basic structure of his moral religion and the claim that morality leads inevitably to religion, which is at marginal page 6.6. The other aim of the preface, the first preface, is to talk about the legitimacy of philosophy talking about theological matters. Why is it okay for a philosopher to talk about this? Is it undermining faith for a philosopher to talk about this? What right or what warrant does the philosopher have using reason to talk about scriptural matters? And I'll say a little bit about that second goal of the preface first, just because to me it's less interesting.
I don't know. I found it pretty interesting, but I've got some
biblical studies major in the house.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, just to set that up, and this is maybe useful for historical setting. Kant, we have to remember that Kant is writing in a society that does not have the separation between church and state that we enjoy in America. So the universities that exist came out of the monasteries in the Middle Ages. A lot of the universities were actually founded by pietists, something that a lot of people don't know. So universities have a religious certain institutional origin, but they are also funded by and have the legal protection and expectations of the state. So for Kant, he has to give an argument for freedom of inquiry to talk about religious matters. And that's a big part of what that first preface is doing in its second half. He's trying to talk about one of his most cherished subjects in his political writings, freedom of the pen. And he has to make a case for his kind of right to do this. Now, a number of people were doing this in Kant's day and age. He has a lot of praise of Frederick the Great in Prussia for allowing quite a lot of religious tolerance, quite a lot of tolerance for scholars to intellectually go wherever they please, wherever the argument takes them. Nonetheless, what's floating in the background here is something that would be kind of striking for us nowadays. The fact that you could not be an atheist, at least openly, and hold a university position. There was a German philosopher who comes after Kant, inspired by Kant, named Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was fired from his job in 1799 on the charge, the grounds, the accusation of him being an atheist. So this should be borne in mind, that this is not just something that can be taken for granted. This freedom to sort of be openly an atheist or whatever. Now, some people take that to then, they use that as a lens for reading what Kant does in this book. And as they see it, Kant is secretly an atheist, or his ideas are maybe like a Trojan horse for atheism. And he cannot be outspoken. He has to fly under the radar. And a lot of what he's doing here is using the language of Christian imagery to try to convey ideas, the things that he does not truthfully hold. I think there's a lot of problems with that interpretation. This is very appealing if you are influenced by Leo Strauss, who thinks that philosophy is intrinsically atheistic and has been since time immemorial, ever since Socrates, the time of Socrates. I could expand on that. The basic thing Kant's trying to do is just say, look, it ruins both philosophy and theology to not allow the philosopher to reflect on these things. So, did we want to talk more about that, or did we want to talk about the other goal?
We will. I have some thoughts and some questions for you about that I think I need clarification for, because it's and this goes back. I think it'll come back to this idea of God being sort of this datum of consciousness that, well, we can't know, but we can, whatever. We'll get back to that at some point. What I really would like for you to do is to set up the practical postulate for God, and then maybe speak, and for the highest good, and maybe speak to why there isn't self-love involved in these postulations that would then corrupt the purity of the moral law's autonomy. So I'll just let you do that, because that seems to be and I'd also maybe like for you to address this phrase inevitably, right? Because it seems like you've mentioned already throughout your time with working with Noetic, is that you've mentioned that not everybody has this uniform interpretation of Kant. There are plenty of atheistic Kantians, and you consider yourself maybe even in a minority who don't view him as this crypto-atheist. So obviously there are Kantians who don't believe it is inevitable to postulate rational belief or rational faith. So I'd like for you maybe to tease out that term inevitable when you develop Kant's postulations for God and the highest good.
Sure. So the term inevitable in German is unumgänglich, ungo-aroundable. To translate it flat.
I like that.
Yeah, it's ungo-aroundable. So there's no way. So this is Kant's basic story. You can absolutely be a moral person and be an atheist. You do not have to first be a religious person before you can be moral. However, he thinks that in order to stay a moral person, in order for morality to be a stable disposition and habit, you need to have faith of a very certain kind, moral faith, which is not the same thing as what he calls theological morality, where we base. So for Kant, we need to base religion on morality and not the other way around. We cannot base morality on religion. So that's the basics. Now, which part of that do you want me to go into first? Because you asked several things, right? You asked about the highest good. You asked about how self-love is not a part of this, and you also asked about postulates.
Right. So.
All right. We back? All right. So you asked me to talk about four basic issues, or sort of kind of queries that we might have going through these prefaces to Kant's Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. Those four are how Kant gets to God and the highest good, how this Kantian faith sustains moral agency without infecting it with impurity or self-love, what it means for Kant to say that religion is inevitably following from morality, and fourth, why Kantians differ on rational belief if it's so inevitable. So those are four really fantastic things. I'll try to do justice to all of them. I think the best place to start is with what Kant means by the highest good. So it isn't the highest good for Kant is happiness in proportion to virtue, is a very kind of stock phrase that he uses a lot. Notice that it's happiness in proportion to virtue and not virtue in proportion to happiness. That's because, and this is something that he makes pretty clear in the second critique, the critique of practical reason. What virtue is this. There's two parts or components to the highest good, and one of them is virtue, the other is happiness. And virtue is what he calls the supreme good. It's the thing that is unconditionally good, that is just what we should will all on its own. However, there is nothing wrong with also being happy, provided that we're good. So the idea of the highest good is that those who do good should also fare well. So it's a commensurateness between well-doing and well-being, or rather well-being to well-doing. I sometimes like to explain the highest good as virtue being allowed to blossom. This kind of speaks to your second question of why the highest good, or the hope for the highest good, sustains moral striving without infecting it. Because Kant puts our moral disposition first and foremost in that equation. Now, the question might be, okay, well, but didn't he say in the groundwork that any sort of moral system based on happiness, or any sort of, decision-making that proceeds out of a desire for happiness is immoral, or spurious heteronomy? Well, this is part of the problem, is that a lot of people read the groundwork, and they do so very quickly. It tends to be taught in introductory classes. It's a very condensed text. There's a lot going on in there. And if you read the second critique, it's unpacked out at a sort of maybe greater length, greater pace. For Kant, morality is not about doing the right thing only because it's the right thing to do. It's doing the right thing primarily because it's the right thing to do. I really like to stress that, because Kant holds that we simply cannot do away with our desire for happiness. We just cannot. We are animals. So on the basis of our animality, as embodied beings, also as social beings, we just have a desire to be happy. This desire to be happy, it should also be said, is amoral. It's neither immoral nor automatically moral. So contrary to people like Epicurus or Hume or Mill, who want to define morality through happiness, Kant departs from that. All the same, he does think that our desire for happiness is just irremissible. We can't do away with it. And you're fooling yourself if you think that you can, or that you are. So there's an opposite kind of spurious moral system. And he kind of looks to this in the second critique. He calls one school Epicurean, the school that defines virtue through happiness. And then there's another school, the Stoics. You put quotation marks here because it doesn't really, what Kant actually knew about ancient philosophy was very minimal. The Stoics think that if you have virtue, you just automatically will be happy. So the Stoic sage is happy just while he's being tortured on the rack. Mm-hmm. And Kant thinks that is bupkis. That is not human beings. Nobody is capable of that, for one. And for another, it's very flattering to ourselves to think that we are that way or could be that way. So he is extraordinarily pessimistic and suspicious of people who say that I just do my duty and I don't care what comes about as a result. I don't care if I'm happy or not. That is a bunch of boasting, Kant thinks. That quite often we see that these people are hypocrites. So that's that's a few kind of little elements. Is this making sense so far? Okay. So, so we have this irremissible desire for happiness. Kant also holds a few other things as well. One of them is that there is something about morality that is about benefiting others. So there's something actually from the Metaphysics of Morals, a text that comes after the religion, that's really nice on this. It's he has what he calls a kind of moral catechism. He says, imagine that you've got a pupil and you've got a teacher, and you want to work through with this student the basics of morality. And I might just read some of this.
Please.
Yeah, so this is at German marginal numbers 6480 to 81. The teacher says to the student, now, if it were up to you to dispose of all happiness possible in the world, would you keep it all for yourself, or would you share it with your fellow human beings? The pupil answers, I would share it with others and make them happy and satisfied too. The teacher then says, now that proves that you have a good enough heart, but let us see whether you have a good head to go along with it. Would you really give a lazy fellow soft cushions so that he could pass his life away in sweet idleness? Or would you see to it that a drunkard is never short of wine, and whatever else he needs to get drunk? Would you give a swindler a charming air and manner to dupe other people? And would you give a violent man audacity and strong fists so that he could crush other people? Each of these things is a means that somebody wishes for in order to be happy in his own way. People says, no, I would not. The teacher, you see then that even if you had all happiness in your hands and along with it the best will, you still would not give it without consideration to anyone who put out his hand for it. Instead, you would first try to find out to what extent each was worthy of happiness. So I think this is very nice because it is putting in a pretty intuitive form that anybody, regardless of how appealing or unappealing religion is to them, can see as the legitimacy of the desire for the highest good. We want others to be happy, but that happiness cannot come at the expense of virtue. We see what's morally wrong with that. So the highest good is happiness in proportion to virtue. We also see that if we had our druthers, if we were in charge of the world, we would dispense this happiness to everyone who deserved it. And this is precisely the scenario that we imagine in the case of God. So what Kant is trying to do is he's trying to say that the desire for the highest good is an impartial desire. It's not this selfish, egotistical, mercenary thing. It's not Pascal's wager, where you're only thinking about your own independent happiness and basically gaming the system of the moral law in order to reap a benefit later. So when we talk about the highest good in Kant, it's really important that we see that it is not just individualistic, but is communal, pertains to the community of all rational beings. So even if you yourself might find the idea of the highest good distasteful, you might think, oh, you know, I don't need that, this is going to impurify my moral striving. What about other people? Do you really not hope that other people who are virtuous will see that virtue bear fruit, and that it would be best to have a world where they would be happy? Does that help?
Yes, totally. I think the question becomes, and I think even in this, in what we have prepared today, I think he encourages someone to take a look at a world where happiness is rewarded in accordance to virtue, and kind of shows that objectively it is a more rational state of affairs than one that doesn't. But there seems to be maybe this false binary where there couldn't be other options besides that. I guess the question becomes, and maybe you've already addressed it in regards to how happiness is inbuilt and it's endemic to our human being, this inevitable, this ungo-aroundable nature of the postulates for the higher good, for the highest good, and for God, is it, and how it's the case that so many Kantians are agnostic and atheistic, if it is so inevitable? Do they feel it and then sort of use speculative reason to smother those practical postulates? I mean, would every Kantian be like, yeah, it is something inevitably that my practical reason projects out, but speculative reason is in control, and I'm just going to put the pillow over that?
I don't think that's it. In my experience, this is just anecdotal, but in my experience talking with most Kant scholars and reading most Kant scholars on this issue, there's basically, if they think that Kant is wrong on the question of faith in God, there are basically two kind of camps that they fall into. The first is the camp of those people who think that there is something impurifying about hoping for the highest good in this kind of sense. They think that no, it really does kind of erode the autonomy of morality. The other camp are those people who think that the highest good absolutely is, as Kant says, a necessary dimension or extension of moral striving, but we don't need to believe in divine assistance or agency in order to kind of continue on in that moral conviction. Instead, we can have faith in a moral community of human beings working in concert. And this group of scholars tends to put a lot of emphasis, especially upon the third section of Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. As you work through the text, you're going to see Kant eventually talking about what he'll call an ethical community. Mm-hmm. I depart from that reading because immediately after he introduces this idea, he also says that from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. And what he means by that is you can't have this ethical community without thinking of someone at the head of it, God. And this also then pertains to questions of grace in the divine assistance in the overcoming of evil. A lot of people have a lot of problems with that because they see it as a kind of betrayal of the idea of free will. Scholars who I mentioned earlier, Nathan Jacobs and Chris L. Firestone, I think are right to interpret Kant as having what I guess theologians would call a synergistic conception of grace, rather than a monergistic one. So it's both God. The conception is it's both me and God working in tandem, rather than letting God do all of it.
That makes a lot of sense, considering, because there's this language, I think it's also in the second critique as well, but I can't remember if it's the second critique or the religion, because I read both around the same time, where he does bring in the issue of divine assistance at some point, where it's like you have to begin with the mentality that there is no divine assistance, that can implies ought, or ought implies can. But then later on he also brings in this idea of like there is sort of this like, I mean, issues of the moral feeling and issues of like divine assistance. Like he does sort of like, it seems like brings those things in through the back door in some ways. Like,
oh yeah, so this is Nietzsche's famous criticism of Kant, that Kant was a clever fox who sprung out of the cage of religion, but then crawled back in. Yeah, so I mean, you can see it as that. I don't see it that way. The section that you're talking about with grace is in the section, the postulate of immortality, as well as some stuff that comes a little bit later, and then it gets really fleshed out in the second section of Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. So in this sense, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves by talking about something that isn't in the preface. I can expand more on that if you want, but maybe we'll just kind of leave that aside, and shall we?
I think it's pretty good. I think I'm pretty satisfied. I don't know about you, Matt. I'm pretty satisfied with how Joseph has addressed some of the primary concerns with the practical postulates. Do you have anything else you want to ask before we move on to perhaps this distinction between the different types of theologians that Kant mentions in the first preface? I'm trying to figure out specifically, how to think of the biblical theologian versus the philosophical theologian, where their domains are, how they trespass into them, and how they ought to really relate to one another.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything.
All right. Joseph, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Do you recall that?
This is a portion of the text that I don't deal with as much. So maybe just talk through what you're thinking, and we can have a discussion.
Sure. So I'll do my best to kind of recall this if I can get it right. But he seems to want to, and maybe this speaks to some of the historical background that you gave in regards to how the university was emerging out of monasteries, and there was conflict about what body of knowledge. But it's these scholarly philosophical theologians that are working out rational faith using reason, sciences, and whatnot, and then you have individuals who are using biblically inspired events who may cherry pick from the arts and sciences every once in a while to bolster their case. But I think Kant seems very preoccupied with maintaining a distinction between philosophical theology and biblical theologian. I think it becomes more interesting. I think I understand it intuitively, what that means, to care for the arts and sciences versus caring for the welfare of souls, and how you can care for the arts and sciences and simultaneously care for souls. It's not like you have to be either or. You can have a philosophical theologian also be gifted in biblical theology. I think the thing that is very interesting to me that occurs in the preface to the second edition is he talks about how there are these concentric circles. And at first I thought he was saying something to the effect of there being revelation in that first concentric circle, and then an enlarged sort of rational faith outside of it. But the way that he seems to talk about it is that rational faith seems to be its own form of revelation, and that revelation, it actually is the inner circle. If I can find a passage here from page 40, since after all revelation can at least comprise also the pure religion of reason, whereas conversely the latter cannot do the same for what is historical in revelation, I shall be able to consider the first sphere of faith that includes the other, a narrower one within itself, not as two circles external to one another, but as concentric circles. The philosopher, as purely a teacher of reason from mere principles a priori, must keep within the inner circle, and thereby also abstract from all experience. That's from page 40 of the Cambridge edition. Mm-hmm. And I think it maybe goes back to some of the issues we talked earlier about, the rational faith being the divine in some way, and still trying to understand what conscience and rational faith is communicating to us if it's not knowledge of God, but it's certainty on another level. So have I given you enough to clean up there?
Sure. So I think Kant is entering into a discussion in 18th century Germany. The German Enlightenment, unlike the French Enlightenment, was profoundly religious. So when we hear the word Enlightenment, we tend to think of Voltaire, we tend to think of Hume, we tend to think of people who are deeply anti-clerical. Not so in 18th century Germany. The German Enlightenment, like I said, a lot of the universities were founded by very religious people. People were very concerned about how to reconcile reason and faith. Kant's certainly not the first to do this. What's the crisis that's going on? Well, the crisis that's going on is basically a result of Christian missionaries going to China and seeing how deeply moral the Chinese are, and how they can have such a harmonious society without Christianity. How is this possible? And this occasions then this sort of decades of reflection about what we can know of moral and religious truths independent of revelation. And what Kant's doing here in this second preface is he's trying to talk about the traditions and the imagery and the practices and the institutions, all this stuff that we've inherited. And he's trying to sift through it, and he's trying to say, which of these things holds up to pure rational critique that any human being, regardless of their background or origin, could engage in? Because Kant is very much trying to avoid just falling, he's very worried about falling into the trap of just starting with the idea that the Bible's true just because that's how you were raised. He's very aware of the provincialism of that way of thinking and how immoral that can be, to just sort of from the outset consign a huge section of humanity and of history to the outer darkness. So instead, you need to begin from this standpoint of pure rational sort of critique. And what this means is not that we throw out all those religious traditions. It's that we comb through them and then we see, here's the ones that have a rational kernel, or a kernel of what fits with this pure a priori practical reason. Here's the ones that don't. And here are the ones where it's ambiguous, or there's a certain way of interpreting it that you can engage in. So Kant is taking a much more subtle approach than maybe we might think. Now, there are certain things that he's going to say. He edges just up to the point of wanting to chop off with a meat cleaver, like the story of Abraham, like we were talking about, right? He finds it very hard to interpret that story in a way that's going to fit. Nonetheless, there are other things. There's a whole long section, I think it's in the third section, where he goes through all these different scriptural passages, and he says, like, this fits with this, what I'm saying. This fits with it. This fits with it. So the concentric circles thing is Kant trying to convey that there is a kind of pure rational religion, mere reason, right? Humble reason. Nonetheless, when you look at it rationally, there is a certain tradition that best captures or best symbolizes what it's driving at, and that is Christianity. Now, what Kant knew about other religions, he could fit on a postcard. So this is maybe, gives some merit to people being skeptical about Kant's religion. How much did he know about Buddhism and its capacity to be a rational religion? How much did he know about Islam? That wasn't filtered through a very Islamophobic lens. Now, he does seem to know more about Judaism, but as you're going to discover when you start looking into it, it's questionable what he says about Judaism and whether it isn't steeped in some anti-Semitism. And
really?
Yeah. So this is something that other figures are better about. Hegel knows more about other religions, but he's still very Eurocentric. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but significantly, one of Kant's students, Herder, is very interested in other cultures and actually knew Hebrew and Chaldean and was learning Sanskrit. Part of that is the influence of one of his teachers, Johann Georg Hamann, who was Kant's personal friend and Derrida before Derrida ever happened. All right, we're not going to talk about Haman. I'll go on.
Matt desperately wants to.
Yeah.
We will one day. I like this. There was this passage, maybe to parallel a lot of what you've said. There was this passage that I may confuse or may elaborate upon these ideas even further. Also from page 40 of the Cambridge Companion. He says, you know, in regards to this concentric circle idea, were this not so, we would either have two religions in one person, which is absurd, or a religion and a cult. In which case, since the latter is not like religion, an end in itself, but has value only as a means, the two would have to be often shaken up together that they might for a short time combine like oil and water. However, they would soon have to separate again and let the purely moral religion, the religion of reason, float to the top.
Yeah.
So, like, he does. I get the sense here, like, he doesn't. He's not saying that Christianity is a cult, right? Because, like, it would either be extraneous or another religion of sorts. Like I think it seems like what he's saying is that the purely rational religion and Christianity are like opposite sides of the same coin, that they're really inextricable. Would that be a wrong way to understand that?
I think that...
How does that fit into the concentric circle model?
Well, so what he means by cults is not like what we in everyday usage mean by cult.
He means like the cult of like practice, right? He doesn't necessarily
That's
mean...
right. That means like... You know, it means the ceremonies and the sort of things that you do as part of religion, right? So, like, do you know, in Hinduism, it might involve a puja ritual, or rosary beads, like, you know, doing the rosary, like those are bowing before the communion altar, like those are cultic practices. That's what he means by cult. So, what Kant is. This comes out mostly in the last and fourth section of the book, where Kant's going to talk about various religious practices and the extent to which those can be made amenable or are already amenable to moral religion. There are certain things that people do that might be helpful for encouraging moral striving and conviction that brings about the highest good. And there are things that don't, right? So, for example, saying the Jesus prayer and then thinking that that means that you're good and you're set. Kant is just heaps scorn on that idea. He thinks that there is a lot of hypocrisy in that, and he calls it Afterdienst, or counterfeit service is how our translation has it. And Afterdienst, after means heinous. So a lot of what the priests are doing, like things coming out of their rear. So he's excoriating a lot of what he calls external practices and thinking that those can substitute for an inward change of heart. And he thinks that's the real message of Christianity, is this repentance and bringing about of the new man. And he thinks that to the degree that those practices can promote that, those are rational. And there's a number of those things that he actually does think contribute to that. For example, the Lord's Prayer, he thinks there's a way that can promote religion, this kind of pure religion. The same thing with singing hymns. The problem comes in when we think we can substitute those things for a moral conversion. So that's what's going on with the stuff about a cult as opposed to religion. Kant, oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, that's actually fascinating because so I was just reading this isn't one necessarily the topic of Kant, but it is related to a discussion. I was reading an essay the other day in a book, Kierkegaard and Christian Faith, and there's an essay in there by Paul Martins where he talks about Kierkegaard and Stanley Hauerwas. So for Kierkegaard, we all know about subjectivity and inwardness and how those things constitute like true religion, if we want to use some Kantian, religion in the Kantian sense, like good religion, true religion, right religion, happens through inwardness. But for Hauerwas, who's a popular Anabaptist theologian, true Christian conversion happens through the deeds that one does by participating with the community, that you participate through the outward actions of the visible community, and that constitutes conversion. It's an alternative to the outward deeds and actions of surrounding culture in the world. And so this is interesting. And I tend to be a little critical of Hauerwas on that regard. So even though he was apparently influenced by Kierkegaard, I don't think he likes Kierkegaard's inwardness. So this distinction here, I actually think is really cool in that regard, because it's a cool critique of even a lot of modern theologians.
Yeah, and just one thing to kind of add to that. So Kant's account of moral conversion comes in the second part of the book, and then in the third part of the book he talks about community. And church for Kant is about people who have made that conversion encouraging one another and acting communally in ways that promote the highest good. So he is also for changing our society and our world. The big thing that he's worried about is people thinking that they are acting on some kind of divine mandate who in fact have not made this conversion and are just using religion as a pretext for reckless, irresponsible, atrocities. And Christianity has, shall we say, a checkered past when it comes to some of those things.
Well, the thing that I can't get over, and Joseph, I think what you're saying, I feel like what you're saying about how Kant relates to Christianity and religious cult and stuff like that seems to comport with the narrative of what I've been told about Kant before. But I just can't get over this aspect of him saying that the philosopher dwells in that inner circle of the concentric circles. It seems like the way that the Kantian project is going is that the Christian faith is going to be subjugated to the rational Kantian faith, and we're going to be able to, sift out what matches and what doesn't against that standard. But the way he's talking about these concentric circles here, it makes it sound like the philosopher is swallowed up by revelation, which I'm reading as Christian revelation. It almost seems I believe I'm just having trouble with this passage and what we're saying.
Okay, so maybe attention to the text itself will be helpful. So let's take a look again.
It was on page 40, yeah.
Yeah, so since, after all, revelation can at least comprise also the pure religion of reason, whereas, conversely, the latter cannot do the same for what is historical. So the latter, being the pure religion of reason, cannot do the same. It cannot comprise what is historical in revelation. I shall be able to consider the first, revelation, as a wider sphere of faith that includes the other, the religion of reason, a narrower one, within itself, not as two circles external to one another, but as concentric circles. The philosopher, as purely a teacher of reason, from mere principles a priori, must keep within the inner circle and thereby also abstract from all experience. So I think all Kant is trying to do there is he's just trying to say that he's trying to concede. This is Kant's classical humility. So he's trying to concede that there may be truths that there may be truths that reason cannot perceive or have access to. And it could be the case that revelation has access to those truths. The issue is, how can we responsibly, as sort of scrupulous, conscientious people, go about our lives, sharing the world with people who didn't come. Not everyone came from a tradition with the same revelation, the same revelatory tradition. How can we also do justice to their questions, their inquiries, their perceptions of what's moral and right? And so the philosopher just confines himself to that. Another part of what Kant's trying to do here is he's trying to argue that it's legitimate for him to just deal with things that secular reason can see without already bringing Scripture into it. And then, after working that out, then move towards Scripture and assess it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I appreciate that clarification. But it almost seems like that these concentric circles could be like swapped out. Like if I came from another tradition where revelation was valued, that the philosopher's concentric circle could be inside that one. Say, like, if I'm coming from an Islamic tradition or whatever, like, you could have that philosopher exist within that. Or if you didn't come from one at all, then you just sort of have that single sphere that the philosopher exists within.
Right.
From what you're saying. So if you're coming at it from another faith perspective, or you're coming at it from a no-faith perspective, the philosopher's sort of parameters are always maintained.
That's right. So Kant says later on.
I feel like a good infographic coming on here. I feel like we could do this, and we could have all these concentric circles and really complicate things.
Yeah. No. I mean, it gets very complicated. One thing that Kant says later, and I'm unfortunately blanking on the exact part in the text. I know it's in the third part. Here it is. This is page 116 of the Cambridge in English, the German 107 to 108. Kant writes, "There is only one true religion, but there can be several kinds of faith." What he means by that is, look, there's only one moral religion precisely because there's only one moral law.
Yeah.
And there's only one human reason. So as you say, from no matter what tradition you're in, everything that's in that circle, the narrower circle, should be the same. If it's not, then we messed up somewhere along the line, and we subject that to critique.
Now, I'm a very visual thinker. So then,
Okay.
so like, what I would tend to do if I were to think of, like, if I'm coming from a Christian perspective, and I'm talking about that narrower circle within that the philosopher is in, there's the gap between those two concentric circles would be relatively small. And then maybe it's a little bit bigger if I'm coming from a Jewish tradition for Kant, and then maybe bigger if I'm coming from the East.
Mhm.
And would that be an incorrect way? I mean, I don't know enough about Kant to say that, but it seems like those other traditions might be a little bit further away. But does it really matter? And the question then really, does it really matter? I mean, the distance between them each in a way is an infinite chasm. Like, even though, like, Christianity may be a concentric circle that is only slightly larger than the philosopher's narrow circle, like, that doesn't make it a one-to-one relation.
That's right. Yeah. No. So this is the danger then of holding a religious faith without first having a kind of moral basis for it. Now, we need to be careful here. There's two different things that can be going on. The first is Kant thinks that you can have no philosophy background or even theology background and be a moral person and also a religious person in his sense.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely because for him, morality is, I don't want to say commonsensical, but accessible to everyone, and it's very simple. The categorical imperative is just the question, what if everybody did that? This is very intuitive. Now, the second thing, though, is that nonetheless, there's a lot of chatter out there about God and about religion, and there's also a lot of nonsense and a lot of hypocrisy. And without philosophers critiquing that hypocrisy, people can be very easily led astray into a kind of pseudo-religion of external performance and not get that the importance and legitimacy of that internal renewal of one's mind or spirit. And without that, one, we have superstition, But two, kind of almost as a reaction to the superstition, you can get unbelief, right? People saying, we don't need no stinking God. If this is what religion is, well, then I want no part of it. So does that help?
Yeah, I think that's phenomenal, man. I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover today. So I'm going to rest my interjections and interrogations. But I mean, the lucidity that you've brought to this text, man, is previously unfathomable to me, and I can't thank you enough for being a part of this.
Oh,
Matt,
well, I mean, I appreciate the compliment, but part of it too is just working through the text itself, and it gets easier as you get through the text. You're going to see the first part is the hardest. The second part is also pretty hard. The third part starts getting easier, and the fourth part is very accessible. And they also get a bit longer, the parts. But you'll start to see by the end of it, it'll all be making a lot more sense.
And
so,
if there's, what I notice when I search for resources, because I've got so many irons in the fire, I don't really have time to read a lot of secondary material. So I have to consume a lot of audio and video resources. If you know off the top of your head or later, know of any lecture series on this that would help us make a better educational product for Noetic, other scholars that we can promote, please send those on and
sure.
give shout.
One thing that comes off the top of my head, I mean, there's a lot of various things I can suggest. For my money, this is my personal opinion. If you are looking for any single book that is just phenomenal, on Kant, it would be probably this one by Susan Neiman, The Unity of Reason. I think this is a fantastic book. It's just incredible what she does in this book. It's just a marvelously accessible, jam-packed, well-written overview of Kant's conception of reason, how it's historically situated, who he's responding to, what he's claiming, why he claims it. It doesn't get bogged down in minutiae. I can't recommend it highly enough. That's a fantastic text. What are some other good things? I think another good scholar to look at, ones who take a different interpretive tack than I do, would be Alan Wood.
Yes.
Is I think a very good interpreter. I disagree with him a lot on certain things, but Alan Wood's a very good interpreter. There's Stephen Palmquist is another interpreter who I rather like.
What do you think about Geyers?
I'll embarrass myself if I keep trying to think of more examples off the top of my head, and there's going to be all.
What do you think about? Are you a fan of what Geyers done, or do you like what Geyers' work is?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, I have some of the same disagreements that I have with Wood, but I think that I am more persuaded by Geyers, especially Geyers' interpretation of what grounds Kantian morality and its foundations. I kind of agree with him more than Christine Korsgaard. So I don't really buy the constructivist interpretation. He's someone definitely worth looking at. There's some really exciting stuff. Oh, another figure who I may have buried here, actually. One second. This is a fantastic book, maybe for more advanced reading, but Kant and the Creation of Freedom by Christopher J. Inzoll. This is also a fantastic book on a lot of subjects of Kant's religion.
When's your book come out?
No, there's no book. There's various articles. Lately, what I've been trying to work out is Kant's postulate of immortality, which is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the postulates. It always gets overlooked in favor of the God stuff, but it comes first and works independently of the stuff on God, and it's, I think, really fascinating.
We'll revisit it. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing? Because I probably need to move on to the other classes that I have planned for today.
No, I'm just sitting at the feet of the teacher.
Yeah,
Oh, boy.
that was a really those were really wonderful lessons, Joseph, and like I said, I hope our professional relationship continues to blossom, and that you're always welcome back whenever you have time.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me and having me here on the program, and I hope it was helpful for people.
Oh yeah, man, it was great. All right, guys, I'm going to end it, and I'll send out the links.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye.